Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Old South Meeting House. My name is Erica Lindemuth. I'm the Education Director here at the Meeting House, and I'm very pleased to welcome you this evening to the second lecture in a four-part series, 18th Century Massachusetts Furniture, Form, Function, and Fabrication.
Tonight's speaker is Nathaniel J. Sheidley, who's historian and director of public history at the Bostonian Society. The title of his lecture tonight is Seat of Empire, Refurnishing Boston's Historic Council Chamber. Will you please welcome Nat Sheidley?
I'm delighted to be here this evening. Thank you, Patrick, for the very kind introduction. I want to thank you especially for plugging our play to be next spring in this amazing chamber that I'm going to be speaking about this evening. And Erica, thank you for so graciously hosting the event this evening. It's inspiring to be here at Old South Meeting House and to be speaking to you in this hall. It's inspiring for a wide range of reasons. It's lovely to be talking about furniture here, which is a subject that I've come to be very passionate about, knowing that I'm speaking to many who know a great deal more about the subject than I do. I hope perhaps I may learn something in the question and answer session that follows. It's also, of course, inspiring to be here in this hall whose walls echoed with the voices of so many great orators over the years. I've never had a chance to speak here, so I'm delighted to have a chance to come this evening and talk to you about this project. It's also lovely to be part of the 4 Centuries of Massachusetts Furniture Project in this way. It's something that we were aware of, and I had a chance to be part of the planning conversations about when we embarked on our project to reinterpret the council chamber. But it's so wonderful to have such a long period of focus on furniture in so many different venues and coming at the subject from so many different ways. I will talk a little bit about form tonight, but it won't be the focus of my talk. And I will talk to some extent about fabrication, although that's not my area of expertise. I really want to talk to you about the function of furniture, but not the function of furniture in the 18th century, but the function that it can have in a public history context. So it's the way that it can aid interpretation. So I want to explore the important role that furniture played in our recent reinterpretation and reinstallation of His Majesty's Council Chamber in Boston's historic townhouse, now the Old State House, just a block or so down the street as you head north here. I'm going to provide a little bit of an overview of the project, just to give you a sense of where I'm headed here. A little bit of an overview of the project. I'm going to address some of the ways in which the very meticulous reproductions of the chamber's original period furniture were able to support our educational goals and to advance the interpretive messages that we decided were central to the story of the room. I do want to dig a little bit deeper and to get at the process that we used to identify the appropriate models and designs to produce the expressions of the 18th century form that are on display in the council chamber. And unfortunately, none of the cabinet makers who were involved with the project could be here this evening to tell you about their role in it, but I will try to speak a little bit about the work that they did and what we learned from it. And what I really want you to all take away from my comments this evening is that the process of trying to make a great volume of 18th century furniture here in the 21st century in order to advance a story that we knew we wanted to tell in the council chamber, in fact, transformed that story. It made us think differently about the story. It added something to what we understood about the Revolutionary period in ways that were quite unanticipated, at least by me. So I will conclude with some thoughts about that, which I hope will be illuminating for everyone. But what I want to do first is just to get you oriented in time and space, and this may be preaching to the choir for many who are here, but perhaps not to everyone. So I want to make sure that we all are thinking about the space and have a clear sense in mind of what I'm talking about when I refer to the council chamber of the Old State House. So today, the Old State House is one of Boston's best-known icons. It is one of the key stops, as Old South Meeting House is, on the Freedom Trail. We welcome about 100,000 visitors into the museum every year. Many more pass by it and have some interface with it in that way. It's also the oldest public building, not the oldest structure, but the oldest public building, government building, that still survives today from the original British colonies in North America. So it's an important piece of architectural history as well. It was built in 1713, so last year was actually just its 300th anniversary year, to take the place of an earlier townhouse that occupied the same site. So it was built to serve as the seat of provincial government in Massachusetts. It's called the townhouse because it had other functions as well. Province House was where the governor lived, but it was really the center of provincial government. It sometimes was called the courthouse as well because, as we'll see, the highest court in Massachusetts also met inside the walls of this building. Now, just to get us located in space, befitting the function of the building, it occupied a central location at the intersection of the two most important thoroughfares in Boston during the 18th century. You can see it there. I'm very proud of this slide because it has animation, by the way. But you can see it here. Let me see if I can get the laser pointer to work, right? So there's Long Wharf, and it's just up at the head of Long Wharf. So Long Wharf is and King Street, as it was called then, today's State Street, was the axis that brought the bulk of trade in off the harbor and into the city. So that's the street that points out toward the ocean and to the British Empire beyond. And then at the other end of the building was Cornhill Street, which then went through several name changes as you went south and went across Boston Neck. That was the main thoroughfare that brought traffic in from the mainland of Massachusetts, because Boston was this tiny, almost island. So it's a central location. It's where so many people come together. And here it is, occupying this dominant position in Boston. When you put in into the harbor and came up, so this painting is from 1801, James Morrison's painting of State Street in 1801, but it gives you a sense of what you saw when you came off Long Wharf, and you only had about a block or two to go up the street until you got to these beckoning stairs that invited you to come into the first floor of the townhouse, as it was then called. But the main action wasn't on the first floor. The first floor was a place where the public could connect. It was a place where especially well-heeled merchants did business with one another. It functioned as a kind of precursor to a stock exchange. You could buy and sell shares futures in each other's trading ventures in that space, but you could also find out the news, what letters had come in off the ship from Jamaica or from Spain, and find out what was going on in the world. But it was up on the second floor that the work of government was done. And here I've tried to align an engraving of the townhouse from after its reconstruction. It was changed somewhat after a fire in 1747. I've tried to coordinate that with an attempt to reconstruct what the layout of the second floor may have looked like. So just to give you a sense, we can't see the staircase and the balcony in this engraving, but this is the side that faced the harbor. So the council chamber was more or less in this area of the second floor. Today, if you go into the Old State House, there's a big central staircase that leads up, a spiral staircase, but that didn't go into the building until 1830. What was up on the second floor in the 1760s and 1770s was the hall where the General Assembly met, where the General Court met. Elected representatives met in the representatives chamber, and then a much smaller chamber at the west end of the building where the highest court in Massachusetts met until 1768, when they moved up the street to what was then called the new courthouse. So the action is up here on the second floor, and the center of power from the perspective of the empire on the second floor was this room, the council chamber, where the governor met with his 28-member council. Now, the council was a complicated body, and I think even people serving on it in the 1760s and 1770s didn't entirely understand the way in which it was constituted. It's not very clearly defined, and they're struggling to understand it because it has two functions. It has an advisory function, so it's the governor's council. The governor can seek advice, executive advice, from this body, but it's also serving as the upper house of the Massachusetts legislature, and it has a lawmaking function. So bills that are passed first by the representatives in the Massachusetts House of Representatives get kicked upstairs to the council, and they have to approve them before they can be sent off to the Board of Trade and considered on the far side of the Atlantic. So it's a complicated space. There's a lot going on, but I think most people associated this with the royal governor, with the governor's role and the governor's person, and we knew that the way in which the room was organized certainly emphasized that. So that will be something that we had to keep track of as we turned our attention to the furnishings of the room. All right, so that's a sense of the place that we were trying to interpret. We knew that we wanted to tell the story of this room during the Revolutionary period. There it is. But when I first arrived at the old State House a little more than 3 years ago now, it was very difficult when you entered into the council chamber to have any sense of these functions, of the way that the room may have been perceived by people and used by people during the 18th century, what the spaces looked like. There was nothing really that helped to create a sense of place. We all knew that that's what we needed to do, but that's not the way the building had been used for a long, long time. Instead, the rooms, and this is the council chamber in a photograph from 2009, the rooms were organized in such a way that really emphasized the cases in them and the objects on display in the cases, because the Bostonian Society does have a large collection of artifacts relating to Boston history that we had exhibited and continue to exhibit in the building, but you can see that the attention to the space itself is relatively vanilla. What is it that makes this one of the most important spaces in Boston during the 18th century? Well, not a whole lot. What you see there is what you could see in any number of museum gallery spaces in any building that you might go to, where cases, large museum cases, are stationed and objects are on display. So standing there in the council chamber, boy, you had to have a really good imagination to call this to mind. This is from 1761, when the council chamber hosted a 5-hour argument over general search warrants that were being used by British customs officials called the writs of assistance. James Otis came to prominence by arguing against those writs of assistance in a very, very eloquent way, so eloquent and drawing on so many of the arguments that would later be elaborated by others in what would come to think of itself as the patriotic movement or the patriot movement, the Sons of Liberty and so forth, articulating them so clearly that John Adams, much later in the 19th century, looking back on this moment, which is captured here, this is a detail from a mural in the new, no longer so new, State House up on Beacon Hill, but Adams later remembered, then and there the child independence was born, right? But not so easy to see, right, here. Not very accessible except to somebody with a very vivid imagination. It was also very difficult for people to conjure up a second moment of great significance in the story of the American Revolution, which unfolded in the council chamber. That was the argument that happened in the council chamber the day after the Boston Massacre, captured in this famous painting by Copley of Samuel Adams, who's pointing here at the Massachusetts Charter and reminding Governor Hutchinson that despite his protestations, yes, he did indeed have the authority to remove the troops who had been occupying Boston since the fall of 1768 from the town. And Hutchinson started that day saying, I do not have that authority because I haven't received those orders, and that's the way power works in the British Empire. I wait till I get the orders from above. And Adams and Hancock and Joseph Warren and others persuaded him that, in fact, he did have that authority, or even if he didn't think he did, he had to figure out a way to make it happen. Royal Tyler, who was a member of the council, famously warned Hutchinson on this occasion that if he didn't remove the troops, 10,000 militiamen from the surrounding towns would be happy to do it for him. And this is a little-known moment, but potentially one of the greatest turning points in the history of the American Revolution, because the lessons learned by this argument are the very lessons that are going to make it hard to resolve the next round of disputes after the Tea Party in 1773. Both sides draw lessons that are counterproductive to peaceful resolution of the conflict in the later round. So that happened in that space. But man, you stood there and you looked at those cases, and what was there to help you conjure this episode to mind? Not a whole lot. So we knew, in other words, that we had this wonderful story, an important story to tell about the space itself, about the council chamber, and told correctly, it was a story that could not just capture some of the drama and the importance of that moment, of those moments, but also make people think deeply about the history of the American Revolution and think in new ways about it. So, story that we absolutely needed to tell about the space itself. Right, story of the coming of the American Revolution, which was, it unfolded in that space, but was structured in some ways by the way that space was configured. And how could we tell that story? So we knew we wanted to tell the story, we knew we didn't have an ideal space for it, and we knew that we needed, therefore, to restore the feel and the appearance of the space as it had been inhabited at the time, so that people could come in and make that same imaginative leap that maybe some of you have had. For me, I think the most dramatic moment for me as a visitor to historic sites was when I first walked the space on the Gettysburg battlefield where Pickett's charge unfolded. And you could imagine as you stepped over each piece of ground and on that rock that here something so momentous had happened that it changed everything that happened afterwards. And I'm standing right here and I can see this world the way it was seen by the soldiers at the time. It's so hard sometimes to achieve that in a historic structure because the structures have changed. The landscape has changed too, but it's easier to forget that. But the structures change. Our structure, the old state house, has changed so fundamentally over the years. And even if they haven't changed, sometimes we can't feel like we can enter them and access them. Can you walk across the council table like you walk across a battlefield? Well, probably not. But we wanted to try to give people something of that immediate imaginative experience that you could get at other historic sites, and particularly historic landscapes. So that's sort of the genesis of what we at the Bostonian Society came to think of, and in fact this term had been given to it before I arrived at the Old State House, came to think of as the new Old State House project, to take a pass at interpreting the building as a historic site, to recover the interior feel of those spaces and make it come alive for people. So a little bit more about that. So these are the goals that informed us as we set out on this project. Two of these I've already alluded to restore a sense of place in the building and to use that sense of place to explain the site and its significance to the coming of the American Revolution. But this last one I think is equally important, and it's what I was just starting to get at, which is that it was so important to us to create an inviting visitor experience, to make it feel for visitors like they could access the story and connect with that story. So we didn't want to create in the council chamber or in any of the other spaces in the Old State House that experience that you have at some historic sites where because there's so much that can't be touched, that can be damaged. You can't get close, and there may be a velvet rope or some barrier that prevents you from entering. It's to be observed as if the whole room was in a glass case rather than being a space that you can enter. Both approaches, I think, are extraordinarily valid and important, but this was not something that we had wanted to do at our site in this project. So we knew then from the earliest moment that furniture was going to have a really important role in achieving these goals. Why? Well, we couldn't bring John Adams and James Otis back to life, but if we could create the place, the feel of the room, sort of as this hall does, where the events actually took place, then people's minds could be used to populate those spaces and make them come to life. So by furnishing the room appropriately, maybe we could help visitors to imagine where Hutchinson had sat, or where James Otis had stood, or where Hancock and Samuel Adams may have banged their hands on the table when they got fed up with the fact that Hutchinson just wouldn't listen to what they thought was reason. So the furniture, we sensed, would have a really, really important place in this, but we also wanted the furniture to be usable. We wanted visitors to be able to sit in the governor's chair, to lean on the council table, to bang their hand on it, like Adams if they wanted to. What our project called for really, among many, many other aspects of the project, but at its center, what it called for were very, very exacting replicas of the original furnishings. So well constructed that they could stand up to the rigors that the original furniture never had to stand up to, of 100,000 visitors a year coming in and sitting in the chairs and banging on the table. They had to stand up to something quite extraordinary. So that's the background. That's what we had hoped to achieve. Clearly it was an ambitious undertaking. We very quickly ran into a bunch of obstacles which made us rethink what the scope of this project might be. The early planning for the new Old State House had suggested that the price tag for the whole thing might be in advance of several $1 million, not a sum that the Bostonian Society can very easily raise. It takes many, many years to raise a sum like that. We were fortunate, however, in 2011 to receive a wonderful grant from the National Park Service that we thought would be enough to allow us to approach just one of the spaces in the building, one of those 3 chambers on the 2nd floor, and we chose the council chamber as the place to begin and as an experiment for the rest of the project. So it began we began work on this in 2011 as something of a pilot for the larger whole. The second obstacle is one that may help you to understand why we were so adamant about furniture that people could sit in, because we really didn't have the other alternative. The very little of the original furniture from the old State House survived. I think some of it may have been carted up to Beacon Hill when the new State House was opened. A lot of it was destroyed in March of 1776 when the British Army evacuated Boston, when the siege ended. And it was just lost over time. We have one very significant piece of furniture, the speaker's table that was used during the 18th century, but we couldn't populate the room with original furniture that had stood there. So we decided to try to play to turn a weakness into a strength. But it did give us a little bit of trouble, even as we were thinking about making replicas, because how could we know what that original furniture was to look like? And I'm going to turn to that in just a moment. But I do want to say that a third obstacle we also knew we had to get over was how was this stuff to be made, right? There's a lot of furniture that is needed to furnish a whole chamber like the council chamber. 28 members, right? They all had chairs. They needed a table large enough to sit around. The governor had an enormous chair based on the models that we could find in other colonies. So we needed someone who could help us make all of this stuff, and we were very fortunate to find a willing partner in the North Bennet Street School, trade school located in the north end of Boston, where many, many different crafts are taught, but where furniture making, cabinet making is still the sort of core of what they do, and where the 18th century cabinet making traditions are very much kept alive. And when we approached them, they were enthusiastic about getting involved with the project. I think maybe in retrospect they wished that they hadn't been so enthusiastic about it, because it was a lot more work than any of us, I think, anticipated when we began. Okay, I just want to say, I put a bunch of slides in here that give you a sense not just of the place which I've been talking about, where history happened, that we wanted to recover, but the specific story we wanted to tell in that space. So there's so many different stories that we could tell in the council chamber. What we chose to tell was the story of how closely bound to the British Empire Boston was just before things start to fall apart. Because this was the seat of royal power, after all, and for us it seemed like the most important thing to do to help people rethink some of their assumptions about the American Revolution was to push back a little bit against the assumption that, well, the Revolution came about because, well, over almost 200 years, the colonies had been growing apart from the mother country. And we wanted to say, well, actually, if you look closely, there's a lot of trends that look like they're heading toward convergence, where the colonies are more tightly bound to the empire than they ever had been before, right before things start to fall apart. I don't want to go through these in as much detail, because I want to make sure I save enough time to talk in some detail about the furniture, but just to give you a sense. So these are actually just panels taken from the exhibition. So a British town, the council chamber in Boston before the American Revolution, basic idea is encapsulated there. This was sort of the high water mark for the British Empire, and nowhere in Massachusetts was the proximity of Britain felt quite as closely as in the council chamber. This is the best place probably to tell this particular story. We tried to tell it through articulating several themes, and the reason I'm showing these to you is because the furniture captures some of these themes. So the idea that this vast trade in material goods across the Atlantic Ocean increasingly bound the colonies to Britain. There's the flood of English manufacturers entering the colonial markets from 1740 on, and furniture is certainly part of that, although there are very vibrant furniture-making traditions in so many American places as well, but it gives people a sense of being part of a common consumer culture that binds them with Britons. The idea that, well, maybe I can just show you some of the objects that we have on display in the council chamber that try to capture this. Even when things were locally made, often by the second half of the 18th century, they're emulating English styles, so a sense that the material culture is really part of the story of how the colonies are connected to the metropole. Of course, it's also connected by ideas, and if you'd stepped out into the street here and asked any Bostonian in 1764 whether being a British subject was a good thing, probably most of them would have said absolutely, and if you'd asked them why, they would have said, well, because we're the freest people on earth, precisely because they were Britons. So we try to describe that in this space as well, but connected to this idea is another notion that the society in which liberty flourishes is the society in which everyone knows their place, right? A ranked society. Too much liberty, perhaps, is an invitation to chaos, and chaos is an invitation to having a tyrant take over, because people are always eager to restore order when things get too out of control. And so we try in the council chamber to portray some of that hierarchical ranking. So those are some of the key ideas that we were wanting to communicate. And furniture, here's a look at the reinstalled council chamber, not quite in its completed state, but I wanted to show you this one where you could see the whole run of the tables. Now they're covered by tablecloths. But you can see there's the forms of the furniture are part of a larger Anglo-American lexicon of styles. And the furniture, the place of the governor is so easily captured with the furniture, the outsized governor's chair communicating his place at the top of that ordered society, his place at the apex of British Boston. So there's a lot that the furniture has helped us to tell. But you're not here necessarily to hear about that story. You're interested, I think, in the furniture itself. So I want to tell you a little bit more about that. Selecting the designs for the furniture, what should these pieces look like if we didn't have the originals that we could say without question these were in the council chamber in the 1760s? It turned out to be a very complex puzzle. So as I said before, we didn't have the originals. They were lost or destroyed, but we did have some solid leads. We had a fairly good set of records, and here you're going to hear, for someone who works in the field of historic preservation or at a historic site, you're going to hear me say something a little bit unexpected, which is, thank goodness that the building almost burned down in 1747. And the reason I say that, because there was a tremendous fire that began in the building, and it ended up consuming almost the entire interior. Those brick walls remained, but that's pretty much all of the original structure that did survive. There's all sorts of funny stories about the reconstruction. The assembly voted several times because they're trying to leverage Boston paying the cost of rebuilding. And the Bostonians kept saying, well, no, we should each pay thirds, right? The province has to, or maybe the province should pay more than thirds. And the assembly kept voting and saying, well, maybe we'll move the capital of Massachusetts to Roxbury, or maybe we'll move it to Cambridge, and they keep coming back the next day and changing their minds. There's an argument going on about reconstruction, and when they finally decide, yes, we're going to rebuild this building on its previous location, they give the job of overseeing the reconstruction to a merchant who did a lot of work for the provincial government named Jacob Wendell. And Jacob Wendell kept a very good account book, many, many pages long, itemizing everything that was done and the costs attached to it. So that survives. It's available in the Houghton Library. It's a great source of information about what went into that building in 1748. Now, Wendell didn't keep as careful track of the furniture as I would have liked. We can create a comprehensive list of every carver and carpenter and painter who was involved in the reconstruction of the structure of the old State House, but there's spotty records for the refurnishing. And I think that's because in some cases, the furniture may have simply been gifted to the province by wealthy men who were on the council or in the House of Representatives, or perhaps records have been lost over time. But there was quite a bit of tantalizing evidence, and that allowed us, I think, to make educated guesses. So this table is a good example. The records don't ever mention what the council table looked like and who made it, but there is a moment where they replace the leaves on the council table, and there's an order for 8 leaves. And I'd puzzled over this quite a bit. 28 members of the council had to fit around a table. That thing must have been enormous. How did they do it? Well, of course, 8 leaves suggests 4 drop leaf tables, right? And we were able, from the information in the records, to have an estimate of the size of the tables, and we had a good indication in the records of who the maker might have been, because roughly at the same moment that those leaves are replaced, the colony places an order for a square table for the Speaker of the House of Representatives. And that person, the person who made that table, is identified, and that was Benjamin Frothingham Jr., second in a line of furniture makers in Boston, and someone whose work is well known today as one of the great expressions of the 18th century form as it was practiced in Boston. So we identified a table that there's a few of these. There's a form he made more than once. There's one that survives in the Winterthur Museum. There also was recently one up for auction at Sotheby's. I think that's the one I've got a photograph of here. And our partners at North Bennet Street School, Dan Fea, the head of the cabinet making program over there, and Matthew Wada, who was the lead worker on the actual building of the tables, went and traced and copied the design and very carefully reconstructed it. So just one glimpse of of how we solved the problem of figuring out what an appropriate model was. The governor's chair is I'll come back to this later. There's a detail of the underside of the table, which I want to say more about, but not right at this moment. This is the governor's chair. I learned in the course of doing the research for this project that there really is only one surviving example of a North American governor's chair, right? So the British governor of Virginia, the chair that was used in Virginia survives, and that's a photograph of it. You can go and see it at Colonial Williamsburg. So we had that example to look at. It's oversized. It's many inches higher than every other chair in the room where he met with his counsel, which was a good clue for us. We also had some clues in the records. We didn't know who made this. There was no record of the purchase of it, but there was a record of when it needed to be reupholstered. And in fact, the reupholstering this, specifically in crimson silk, silk velvet, was extraordinarily expensive. At the same moment that they reupholstered this chair, they also whitewashed the entire building, fixed a lot of the broken pieces of the stairs, did outside work, repainted a lot of other things. This huge list of work that had to be done in updating the building, and all of that work was roughly equivalent to the cost of just reupholstering the governor's chair. So we knew that upholstery mattered, right? And it was probably the dominant feature of the chair. But we also knew that a form appropriate to Virginia was not appropriate to Massachusetts. In this particular instance, there was no guide. So the decision that we made, and we worked very closely with Gerald Ward from the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, and with folks who know a great deal about furniture in other places. And the guess that we made was that a classic Boston armchair of this sort that was just more or less supersized would communicate the message that we wanted to communicate and capture the essence of what a governor's chair may have looked like in other colonies at the time. It communicated the sort of dominant position of the governor around the table. That was the farthest reach because there was no model to copy. We did we had even less information about the side chairs, the 28 council chairs. And we knew there were 28 because they had to be upholstered too. New seats had to be put on them. So we could surmise that there were seats, that it was the style of armchair where the wood frame is primarily, or rather of side chair where the wood frame is primarily visible, but it has an upholstered seat. We knew a little bit about the nature of the upholstery. We knew very little else about the chairs. But here, I think we had a clear set of guides. We knew this was a high-style room and that the chairs should express the high style as it was practiced in Boston during the 1760s. And when you start looking for examples, there are many, but we selected as our primary model this classic Rococo form. Those owl's eyes are very expressive of the Boston form and the turn of the legs. There's a lot about this that was classic to Boston during the period. It seemed like a great expression of the form for us to choose. So we copied this chair from the Museum of Fine Arts as the bulk of the side chairs, but we also wanted to show the variation of the form, the variety of the form that was practiced or that was built in Boston during this period. So we also, at the high end, made an attempt to copy this chair, this very, very elaborately carved chair. It was owned by a future lieutenant governor of Massachusetts named Moses Gill, also currently on exhibit at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. And Dan Fea, the head of the North Bennet Street School cabinet making program, hand-carved that entirely himself and made a beautiful copy of it. And then this one, which is sort of an interesting sidebar, we initially were going to use that as our core model, but there's some debate about this chair, which this kind of chair with this shell carving at the top and this sort of vase-like splat in back is often referred to as an Apthorpe family style chair. Charles Apthorpe's family had a set of these, and they've passed down through generations. And there's been a lot of scholarly debate about whether these were made in New York or in Boston. And at the moment that we started the project, the consensus was these were Boston chairs. And by the time we got to making them, new research was presented at the Winter Tour Conference, the annual furniture forum that they have, that no, in fact, they are New York chairs. And so we brought a screeching halt to our production plans and shifted gears. But we did make one of these so that we can interpret the variations and some of the difficulty of knowing where things were made for our visitors. So just quickly to give you a sense of what our versions look like. So here's the sort of primary form that we have emulated. We have 8 of these around the table right now and have plans to add more moving forward. The Apthorpe style chair, which was produced by another North Bennet Street School instructor named Alex Krutsky, and then Dan Fea's beautifully carved, and you can see some of the detail here, beautifully carved Moses Gill chair, or we can call it the Gill Fea chair, I suppose. Just 2 quick points, one to come back to the table, another just to come back to the point that I began with, that we learned a lot about the big story from working with furniture in the way that we did. I can't tell you a whole lot about the details of making this furniture because my role in that process was to observe. I made some visits to the workshop and saw the work in progress and was in awe because the kind of care that was needed was breathtaking, and the speed with which they worked was breathtaking because we didn't give them a huge amount of time to put this all together. And that itself was a little bit of an experience of what the 18th century experience of cabinet makers may have been like. And I think our partners enjoyed it and hated it when they were up night after night trying to get this done. So I can't tell you a whole lot about the details, but what I can tell you is about a principle that guided our work that emerged through discussion and through puzzling over how to handle how true to the originals to be. And the decision that we made was that we would try as fully as possible to be true to the 18th century form and respect the conventions of the Boston craftsmen whose work our cabinet makers were taking as their models, but we also said it's okay to make some modifications. And that may seem like a controversial decision, that we could alter the originals that we were trying to copy, but the decision was guided by a desire to be true not just to the finished form, but also to the process and to the aspirations of the cabinet makers who made the originals and to their role. And to explain a little bit, just very quickly what I mean by that, I want to come all the way back to the table. So this leg emerged as a problem. So in the original, Benjamin Frothingham had taken his leg and he'd taken the 2 side pieces of the apron here and here, right? So the leg comes all the way through to the tabletop, and then there are these apron pieces here. And those were 3 pieces that he attached with mortise and tenon joints, right? A mortise and tenon goes in like that. So each of the legs was tenoned in on both sides and then glued. And our friends at North Bennet Street School said, this is not the best that we can do. And Benjamin Frothingham, if he'd had our tools, and if he'd had the chance to work as we are now in the 21st century, would have made that table differently, because this is not the strongest connection we can make. And they chose to make a bridle joint. So the leg, they cut a slot this way in the leg, and then the apron goes all the way through, and the leg goes around it. And then they've doubled the glue surface, and they've made a much, much stronger leg. And that's going to be hidden for the most part from visitors, but it's there for us to interpret as well. And the argument that they made, and that I ultimately agreed with, was that none of these cabinet makers would come back and make their materials in exactly the same way. The point of being a cabinet maker and an experienced cabinet maker was to learn as you went and to constantly refine your craft. And in this instance, we made a decision to privilege that over the form as it was expressed in the 18th century. We made a different decision with the Moses Gill chair, and there were very strong limitations on this. Everything, where we made modifications, they were mostly not going to be visible to the ordinary visitor, but we thought that this was a fair thing to do. I said also that we wanted to be true to their role, to the role of the cabinet makers, and one of the reasons for making some of the modifications was because of the volume of furniture that was being made, and by so many different people. We needed 10 craftsmen to make these pieces of furniture. It was an extraordinarily large project, and it was here that we learned, I think, the most about the big story by working on the furniture. We started out thinking that furniture would help us tell our story. It was basically an instrument. It was a tool. We were interested in furniture, but mostly it would help us say what we wanted to say. It would be lovely illustrations of the big points that I listed before. But, and I do think that it's doing that. It's succeeding in communicating our messages. But in addition to being a useful tool and allowing us to tell our story in a new and I think more engaging way for our visitors, it also did something more for us. And the challenge of producing all of that furniture by hand in a very short period of time taught us a lot about what it was to do that work during the 18th century and to do it in Boston, and what that meant for Boston as a place. So today, many of the best furniture makers work alone. They work in their studio, and they're producing their work as an expression of their unique artistic vision. That's not what happened in the 18th century. Cabinet makers worked for a client, and a wealthy client might come in and say, you know, I need 28 chairs, and I need them by X time. And these guys had to crank it out. They were working on commission. They were making a useful tool for their clients. And in order to meet the demands of their clients, they couldn't do the work alone. They had to go out there and find others. I'm not so good at turning a leg. I'm not so good at carving that foot on that chair. I'm not great at this piece of carving, or I don't know how to do the upholstery. Stuff got subcontracted out, and these guys worked close by each other in close connection day after day, and my penny depended on his penny, and it was a part of a large craft community. Now, as a historian, I've read that a million times, but I didn't really see what it meant until I was standing there saying, we've got to get this furniture done. We've got another 3 weeks to get it done. How are you going to do it? And all of these folks are coming together to put this project together. And what does that mean for our larger story? Well, it means it's not solitary work, it's community work. And we talk as interpreters of the Boston Revolution about that crowd, and about the way in which ordinary working people could mobilize to express their views in Boston, and the incredible impact that those people had. But we don't often understand how they came to be there standing shoulder to shoulder, and it's because their lives were intertwined with each other. It wasn't just their work, it was their very existence totally wrapped around each other. And when your partner tells you about his political views in that way, it means something different than simply hearing it said by somebody else at the coffee shop across the way or whatever. The work of producing material culture, this material culture, the material culture that bound Bostonians to Britain, in other words, simultaneously bound Bostonians to each other, and I think gave the town a really, really powerful set of local loyalties that could be mobilized after 1764 during the imperial crisis that escalated so quickly. Thank you very much. Yes, you've got me.
So I just
No, it's a great point, and I will be entirely frank with you. If we had had more funding, and if we had had more time, we might have made a different decision. We were guided here by the knowledge that in Boston, these chairs were made both with and without stretchers. For those of you who are not aware, what we're referring to are these pieces down below, which do in fact make the chair sturdier over time. And in fact, I would have loved to have had them because it would mean fewer repairs back at the North Bennet Street School workshop on a yearly basis. So far, none have gone back for repair, but I imagine that they would be more durable with those. And honestly, it was just an entirely practical decision that we felt we could make because we knew that there were plenty of examples of chairs. Even if the preponderance would have had stretchers, there were plenty that did not. Thank you, though. That's a great question. Sure, I can do that. Thank you for the question. Let's see if I can retreat all the way to the slide that shows the... Okay, yes, I will. So the question is, can I say a little bit more about the vision for the rest of the building? I've gone past it there. For the rest of the building, since we have only had a chance to pilot in this one chamber, and the original idea had been to do the whole building. We do have some challenges here. We have taken a fairly literal approach to recreating the sense of place in the council chamber. The next room that we need to do, the next chamber, is the representatives' chamber. But if you were paying close attention, you will have heard me say that the representatives' chamber, which was the largest of the second floor chambers, is no more. When the city took over the building and made it City Hall in the 1830s, they reconfigured the space and put in this spiral staircase that goes up here. There are no longer two side staircases, and this room was enlarged and was made into the place where the city council met. So that was the representatives' chamber, one might say. So this is the other chamber that we have now. We only have a central upper rotunda here, and it's quite challenging to help people recover a sense of place. Now, in 1776, the Massachusetts House of Representatives came back from its exile in Watertown, where it was meeting as a revolutionary body, and decided to meet again at the townhouse. And they didn't have enough space for everyone in this building, in this chamber, so they knocked down the walls and made one giant representatives chamber. So we could theoretically say, well, this was where the action happened during the revolutionary period. But the truth is, I think we have to do something a little bit more notional in that space. I'm not comfortable with recreating in verisimilitude the look of the 18th century assembly room, because we're going to mislead our visitors. And at some point, we're going to have to say to them, well, no, the speaker's table wasn't there, it was over here. And I'd feel let down if it were me. So we do have the speaker's table, and what I'd like to do is build a wedge of terraced seating like what was used in the assembly room around it. But to have that speaker's table in conversation with another artifact, we have a fragment of a flag that hung from the Liberty Tree, which speaks about the role of the crowd. So I want in this other space to be able to say something about the tension between the official space in the assembly room where opposition took shape and the unofficial space out in the street, because that's really the tension that animated so much of the revolutionary movement in Boston. And we'll need to make furniture for that, a different kind of furniture, and we won't necessarily be trying to recover in such detail the look of the interior. I'll have to take a rain check on telling you about the first floor, both because we don't have time and because I don't think we're totally confident that we know how to do that space. Thanks. In case others didn't hear it, did we know whether the chairs in the council chamber were matched? We created a mismatched set for interpretive purposes. I puzzled over that question for a very long time and never was able to answer it to my satisfaction. The evidence that we have doesn't allow us to know who made the chairs. We know that when they needed repair, they were repaired en masse. There were some similarities, certainly, between the chairs because all 28 are mentioned in the repair records. However, there's also indications that some of what was used to furnish the building after the 1747 fire was contributed by members of the local gentry. So Isaac Royal donated a beautiful chandelier, or branch of candelabras, as it's described, to the, or branch of candlesticks, to the House of Representatives. And I think the fact that the records are are silent on the purchase of many pieces of furniture suggests that some of this material was contributed. Now, whether somebody donated a full set or whether they, 10 were brought in by Royal and another 10 were brought in by someone else, I can't answer. And it's one of the many questions that I just was frustrated over not being able to get more information about. So I want to come back, though, to the point about the gallery. So there was a gallery put in to the assembly room. It's represented here. There's a lot that's not quite accurate about this diagram, but this is a conjectural idea about where that gallery was put in. And it's put in immediately after the conclusion of the Stamp Act crisis. James Otis and the Boston bench hatched the scheme to put this thing in. It has often been said that it was the first gallery in the Western world or in the English-speaking world, but in fact, research that we've done indicates that was not the case. The Irish Parliament actually had a speaker's gallery sooner, and the Burgesses in Virginia beat Massachusetts to it by 1 year. But I do think the gallery is extraordinarily important to the story that I think we need to tell when we interpret the assembly room. So as I was trying to communicate, the story about opposition is really not a story about colonists and British arguing over policies. It's about colonists at odds with each other over how to respond to British policies. And it's no accident that Otis and others hatched the scheme of putting the gallery in immediately after the Stamp Act crisis, because famously, Massachusetts, the Assembly, has the idea of holding a Stamp Act Congress and inviting all the other colonies to work together to see the Stamp Act defeated. And the resolutions passed out of that Congress, which met in New York, were extraordinarily radical and said, Parliament simply lacks the authority to do this. This is overstepping the bounds of the Constitution. And back in Massachusetts, no one's willing to vote that. So moderates in the Assembly say, nope, no. And what Massachusetts does is send a string of letters off to London saying, while we know that you have the authority, we think that this is an inexpedient policy, because while people have been quite happy to be British subjects, now they're not so sure. And Otis and the Boston bench, the most radical group in the Assembly, are fuming over this, right? It's embarrassing. In our own body, we can't make the same radical stance that those folks did. Well, how are we going to change the votes of those moderates? Well, there's a very, very sacrosanct custom of not reporting out of debate what was said. People are sanctioned, and no one is willing to report out as another representative what a moderate from Western Massachusetts might have said. But maybe we could invite some representatives from the public to observe. And everyone knows as soon as that gallery goes in that whatever the votes are in the House of Representatives, and whatever the substance of debate is going to be reported in the newspapers the next issue that comes out. And if you don't say quite the right thing, well, the crowd that was hanging out at Hutchinson's house in 1765, it might be knocking on your door. And when the next crisis comes with the Townshend duties in 1767, Massachusetts Assembly takes an extraordinarily radical position when they're ordered to rescind their circular letter saying we all ought to work together to defeat this, ordered by the governor to do it, knowing that if they don't, they'll be dissolved. They vote overwhelmingly not to rescind, and the Assembly is prorogued. So I believe it was a very expedient political strategy that was adopted by the Boston bench, and it works. It does have to be part of our story, though. I entirely agree. I did not get to dig as deeply into that literature as, honestly, I think I should have. And if we had been trying to do a fundamental restoration of the chamber rather than to reinstall the furniture, I might have made it would have taken more time and funding. I didn't have the funds to go to London to do the research that I might have wanted to do. But what research is out there was helpful. There's been a lot of work done on Virginia. They're in the middle of doing some work in Maryland. Some of the islands, there's some useful information. What I kept hoping I would find were visitors' accounts. I tried very hard to find accounts of visitors who happened through Boston and had a description in a letter they'd sent to a friend at home. And unfortunately, that hunt for needles is still continuing. I didn't find anything totally new as I had hoped to. Thank you.